settle yourself down, everybody, and whilst you're settling, if you can take out your mobile phones and put them onto silent. Because, what did you say, so bossy? That's my middle name. Right, people will come in, but we're going to get going for what is one of the most fabulous part of our college calendar. And it's the James Mackenzie lecture, and it really is. And we've had an extraordinary day today with 2 new member ceremonies and the naming of the Colin Hunter room after somebody called Colin Hunter. I'm sure you all know him. And now we have a treat in hand. We have a lecture to be given by the lovely Professor Dame Helen Stokes-Lampard. Now, Helen trained in medicine at St George's, and I think she was actually president of the Students' Union, weren't you? Because I think I saw your name up there when I once... But you was Helen Stokes then, so... And she originally started training in gynecology, but then saw the light and moved to general practice. And she's held so many roles over the years, but in particular roles at this college, including the first and only female treasurer of this college. She held the financial strings. Well done, Helen. She was also chair of the Royal College of GPs from 2016 to 2019. And I was earlier today, gave her her medal for the past chair of college. She's a GP principal at Lichfield's Westgate Practice and still practices because she says it on Twitter and I see it, and has many other roles, including the chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, which is an incredible post to hold at the moment, chair of the Board of Trustees of the National Academy of Social Prescribing, and professor of GP education at the University of Birmingham. Helen is held in high esteem in the profession and was awarded Damehood for services to general practice in this year's New Year's Honours List. Helen, can I ask you to join me at the stage? Here's your medal. Can I invite you to give the James Mackenzie lecture?
Thank you very much, Claire. Well, good evening, colleagues. Now then, you'll have noticed that my voice has dropped an octave from normal. So, President, colleagues, Chair, and friends online or down the line, and thank you for the opportunity to give the Sir James Mackenzie lecture in my college. It is so good to be back. But as I'm recovering from a chest infection, the voice is a little bit of a challenge tonight. So forgive the pitch. Also forgive me if I have a little interlude, a bit of coughing. I've got a lot of glasses of water lined up neatly behind this vase of flowers, all very discreet. If any of you swap them in for gin, there will be trouble. I know I've had the threat. And I'm aiming not to do a Theresa May tonight. But perhaps too many apologies to start with. It's a pleasure to give a public lecture. Now that phrase public is really important because it means I'm not going to blind you with science, I'm not going to go into technical detail or minutiae, I'm trying to make this accessible to everyone. But I'm going to start with a quick disclaimer. I wear several hats, as Claire's kindly alluded to, but the views I'm expressing today are my own, and they're not necessarily going to align with those of the various organisations I work with or represent, or indeed that may reference. So, let's see if the technology works. Great. Let me take you on a quick romp through our professional history, share a few of my personal reflections of this pandemic. By the way, this isn't COVID-19 I'm experiencing at the moment. Many tests say so. But I'm then going to take an imprecise peek into the future. And I'm going to ask, and perhaps challenge, is there a future for general practice? Not what is the future, is there a future for UK general practice? And I hope to make you think. I hope to challenge you. And I hope to fire you up because there are big, difficult questions we need to answer. However, when giving an eponymous lecture, it's only courteous and appropriate to start with acknowledgement of the person behind the title. So for the uninitiated, let me introduce you to the remarkable Sir James Mackenzie, who's been described as the greatest of all general practitioners. So, there he is. Sir James, he was a Scottish polymath. Now, our college has a long history of attracting those. I see a few in the audience right now. But he was born near Perth in central Scotland, and he studied at the University of Edinburgh. So born back in 1853. He was a cardiologist in London, as well as a GP in Burnley, Lancashire. He was an academic and a pioneer in the study of cardiac arrhythmia. And in his classic text, The Study of the Pulse, he described an instrument of his own devising that he called a polygraph. Now, we no longer use a polygraph, but it was actually the precursor to the first lie detectors. Now, in another of his texts, with a deceptively straightforward title, Diseases of the Heart, Mackenzie convincingly demonstrated the efficacy of the drug digitalis in the treatment of cardiac arrhythmias. And over a century later, we're still using digoxin in the treatment. But in 1919, wanting to return to general practice, he founded the James Mackenzie Institute of Clinical Research at St Andrews University. And it was there he intended to develop a logic of clinical research, based exclusively on the skills of general practitioners and focused on the early stages of disease. And he used local general practitioners to detail long-term recordings of patients' symptoms and illnesses. But what this quick run through his CV, and indeed that rather austere image, don't convey, is that he was a man genuinely concerned about health inequalities and the challenges of deprivation. He actually wrote a novel about it, one of the little tiny factoids I discovered doing my research. Now look, it wasn't a bestseller, but he tried, and it was important for highlighting the concept of health inequalities to the public a very long time ago. And so for me, what this great man encapsulates, it's much of what our speciality, and indeed this college, are about. The combination of robust evidence, based on observation and experiment, and then applying it in a way that benefits people and populations, making a real impact on real lives. So, 14 years ago, a chap called Martin Marshall gave this lecture, and he called it Practice, Politics and Possibilities. Now, being the articulate classicist that Martin is, he told us about Michelangelo and how he had gazed upon a huge block of marble and said, "I see possibilities." And indeed, that featureless chunk of stone later became the statue of David. But that day, Martin urged us to focus on fighting the battles that we should fight and not be distracted on fighting the things that don't concern us. Now, let's leap forward. We've just passed our 10th anniversary in this spectacular Grade 2 star listed building. But in fact, 10 years ago, the auditorium wasn't ready. And at quite short notice, we relocated just down the road to the Shaw Theatre. And I know there's a few people in the room who made that quick trip down to the Shaw Theatre. But on that day, a dear friend of mine from the University of Birmingham, the late Professor Helen Lester, she was the speaker. Now, unbeknown to most people in the audience, Helen knew that she was dying, and it took an enormous physical and emotional effort on her part to do that. But despite her advanced cancer, she gave a particularly powerful lecture called Being Bothered About Billy, about how being a GP for a homeless lad in Birmingham had completely changed her view of medicine, and how mental health was something that we all needed to pay far more attention to, and she was so right. Indeed, the past decade has seen a transformation and a far greater understanding and appreciation of mental illness more generally. 5 years ago, I delivered a speech at the Royal College of GP's annual conference that came to be known as Enid Shaped Care. And perhaps this is where my personal address to you really begins. In that speech, I outlined the story of my patient, Enid, who I'd known for many years. I'd seen her through the loss of her beloved husband, Brian. And in the years following his death, while she struggled and things eventually came to a head, whilst I could have prescribed painkillers, antidepressants, antihypertensives, or referred her for a hip replacement and counselling, but by chance, and not by slavishly following guidelines, pathways, or protocols, I managed to find something that brought joy back into her life. And I had unknowingly socially prescribed for her. And when Enid had meaning back in her life, she became more active. She lost weight, and her hip pain and her blood pressure gradually settled down, and she never needed that antidepressant. And that speech sparked my ongoing interest in social prescribing. I will come back to that later. But the narrative of that speech struck a chord at the time, partly because our profession felt undervalued and pressurised into delivering a huge amount of protocol-driven care. And also because many GPs recognised Enid in their own patients, someone for whom we know we have made a difference beyond delivering the medical care. So, our Royal College of GPs Latin motto sums this up beautifully. That's a close-up of the Chair of Council's chain of office, by the way. Compassionate care for our patients, underpinned by great scientists. Cum scientia caritas. And as I said earlier, it's what Mackenzie was all about, and it's what we're all about. We make a difference not just by being excellent clinicians, but hopefully through our humanity and seeing beyond the physical and psychological, but by providing truly holistic care that is shaped around the patient, not just around NHS structures. And my rallying call to the government that day, 5 years ago, was this: give us enough time, enough resource, enough people and enough professional support, and we will give you great general practice. Now, indeed, by 2019, we did get an additional massive financial investment into general practice in England, and that's still trickling through. And we got a commitment to improved IT, massively increase the workforce with the additional roles programme, and we got similar commitments in Scotland and Wales. And these are still issues that the RCGP holding government to account on, whatever government we have. But if I was giving that speech today from scratch, much would have changed as our general practice landscape, indeed the whole of health and care, has been transformed for good and not so good by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's what I need to expand on. In March 2020, most of us general practitioners advanced our use of medical technology more in 10 days than we had in the 10 years previously. Also, we started taking infection prevention and control a lot more seriously, for the better. And we got better at valuing our colleagues as people and listening to their ideas and innovations and putting them into practice more rapidly. And the way we delivered many of our services changed radically. So, whilst the pandemic is far from over, an early legacy of COVID-19 means that if I updated Enid's story for today, well, this year, Enid didn't come to the surgery as often. She phoned us to book her on-the-day appointments instead, sitting patiently on the phone, on redial from 8 a.m, her tea getting cold. But when her perseverance pays off and she got through, she's relieved to have an opportunity to speak to any one of the clinical professionals employed at the practice. She took whatever appointment the experienced, courteous and well-informed receptionist who triaged the call offers. But there's no option for her to wait for an appointment with her usual GP for any new problems that emerge, because that's not a luxury our practice can stretch to. Now, recently she got to see our new MSK practitioner. That's what we used to call a physio. He did a brilliant job of investigating her hip pain, including an MRI scan, just in case it was something other than the clinically obvious osteoarthritis. And then he ensured she was referred on to our orthopaedic colleagues to be another number added to the waiting list for a hip replacement. And it was clearly the right thing for her because she fitted the criteria easily. The mental health therapist she spoke to was also wonderful. Gave her time to talk and strategies to help her deal with her feelings of worthlessness. She wasn't bad enough for CBT, and she drew the line at group therapy sessions. But in the end, she did accept a low-dose antidepressant, and she was discharged with a safety net of the mental health team crisis number stored on her phone. Our hugely competent nursing team picked up on the hypertension, and they rigorously followed protocols, and now Enid's on dual antihypertensive therapy and, of course, a statin. And Enid is grateful for all this. The NHS, with all its faults and cracks that the media love to highlight, is giving her so much. But then a few weeks ago, when Enid needed her annual medication review, our clinical pharmacist was off sick. And it just so happened, coincidentally, that she ended up on the phone to her registered GP. Me, or Dr. Helen, as my patients call me. Now, the clinical notes didn't give me any clue at all that Enid wasn't in a good place. And on the phone, it was really hard to pick up on those subtle cues. And yet, because I have known her a long time, I noticed something wasn't right, just as you would have done. So I offered her a face-to-face appointment with me, and she walked through the door, and suddenly I could see the changes. There was no sparkle in those kindly eyes. She wasn't as well groomed as she used to be, and it didn't take me long to establish that she had very little self-esteem, no authority, no sense of control over her own health and well-being. She had become a passive recipient of care, not an engaged collaborator. She had become disempowered and she felt old. Now, of course, I did my utmost to help her in every way I could, and I couldn't fault the individual actions of any one of my colleagues. They were all brilliant. But it did make me reflect on this whole situation. Enid had been showered with care, kind, competent, evidence-based, well-intentioned care. But it somehow fell short because it was all partial care, not holistic. And it seemed to me that the very essence of general practice has been diluted. And with it, my professional satisfaction has been diminished. So there's been an over-medicalisation cost to Enid, a financial cost to the NHS, and a professional cost to me and to you, my fellow GPs. We all feel a bit less satisfied in our professional lives now as we acknowledge the fragmented care of 100 of the Enids, Brians, Sanitas and Mohans on our own lists. So why does this matter? Why have I spent this time talking about this? Look, we all know that the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have seen huge shifts in the world order. We've got a senseless war going on, and the visible acceleration of climate change has all led to costs. Costs to individuals, costs to society, and costs to the NHS. So let me expand on that for a moment. First, the cost to individuals. People have paid a high price during the pandemic, a social sacrifice. The education of our young people has been compromised, and the subsequent economic pressure of our nations have felt most keenly in the homes of our most vulnerable patients who've had to relinquish the greatest control and autonomy. Second, the cost to our society. We're on a roller coaster. We're all aware of the economic knife edge, the exponentially increasing energy and food costs. But of course, the death of Her Majesty the Queen, coming after months of political turmoil, means that in the last 100 days, we've had one new monarch, 2 new prime ministers, and a veritable smorgasbord of new faces in the cabinet. And life just feels unstable at the moment, when what most of us want, I suggest, is some certainty that there's a grown-up in charge, that there is a trustworthy plan. But I'm also guessing that there aren't too many of us in this room or watching this lecture who are genuinely scared about whether we can pay our heating bills this winter or whether we will still have a job by January. We're the fortunate ones. We have to face it in this stage of the pandemic and in advance of what's likely to be the worst recession that most people under 40 have ever known. Many of our patients will be poorer, sicker, and more frightened than we've ever known them. So third, what about the cost of the NHS in all 4 nations? Well, with a huge workforce challenge, precarious ambulance services, the pressure on urgent care, inadequate, unsafe NHS estates and record backlogs for planned care and diagnostics, we're facing multiple points of failure in the NHS right now. Now, I'm going to come back to NHS waiting lists later, but I want to be clear about failure. Failure of the NHS doesn't mean it switches off. That's just the silly, catastrophic language of the media or those who seek to opportunistically undermine the whole fundamental principles of our NHS, those who think a different payment model will magically fix the harms of a decade of underfunding. It won't. There's no evidence to support that hypothesis, and we need to push back against it. But in reality, failure of the NHS actually means multiple discrete incidents that our hugely complex and adaptive system no longer has the resilience to compensate for. Let me repeat that because it's so important. Failure means multiple discrete incidents that we no longer have the resilience to compensate for, and we are certainly in that situation right now in places around the country. And the next step will be that snowballs into multiple major incidents simultaneously, which will inevitably lead to an exponential increase in patient harm, moral hazard, and individual professional moral distress. Not being terribly cheerful, am I? It gets better. At the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, we recently released a report called Fixing the NHS, Why We Must Stop Normalising the Unacceptable. The NHS and many of its most valuable assets, its people, its workforce, are in a dark place currently, and the future's not looking great. And what has gravely worried me is how the public and politicians are at risk of accepting that the current appalling state of affairs, where suboptimal medical care is happening time and time again, is somehow okay. It is not. Yes, we remain in crisis, particularly we will over this winter, but we're not going to be in one forever. And as caring healthcare professionals, we must all unite to say, enough is enough. This is not acceptable. Patient safety must not be sacrificed. Some of you may have seen this truly shocking image, which is one example from the report. This makeshift tent shields David, who's an 87-year-old man with prostate cancer who fell in his back garden. He fractured his pelvis and 7 ribs. The call handlers told his family not to move him and await an ambulance, which was the correct advice. But the family was so worried about his welfare, they constructed this shelter to protect him from the elements. And it's just as well they did, because he waited there for 15 hours for that ambulance. This is not acceptable. We should all be devastated to see this in our society, in our affluent nation. And what troubles me is that there are parliamentarians and policymakers out there who do not feel ashamed or want to weep when they see this. She takes a deep breath. Oh. In our report, we call first for an acknowledgement about the urgency and the gravity of this situation. But we need an open, honest national conversation amongst politicians, patients, the public, healthcare professionals and policymakers about the NHS we have, the NHS we want, and the NHS we can afford. And we need to do it without blame or mudslinging. It's too late for that nonsense. It's too urgent for political point scoring. So I believe it's time for us to take ownership of this. Well, what are our options? What are we going to do about it as general practitioners? Well, we could carry on and hope for the best, but we all know the futility of repeating actions and expecting different outcomes. There's a fashionable quote doing the rounds in Westminster at the moment from Lampedusa's The Leopard. If we want everything to remain the same, everything must change. Some of us want to carry on as we are, but leave the NHS just as soon as we can. And recruitment agents tell me that they're swamped by highly skilled, experienced doctors looking for a dignified way out, a way that doesn't make them look as if they've been struggling. Indeed, the RCGP survey from a few months ago confirms that 25% of GPs across the UK, that's the 4 nations of the UK, are so stressed that they cannot cope most or all days. That's a quarter of us. And so it's understandable for individuals wanting to get out, but that's certainly not going to help the bigger picture. Others want to stop and to strike and make governments see how bad things have become. But we know there are so many reasons why taking industrial action is a dangerous path for senior clinicians to take when it could further jeopardise patient safety. Thanks to the onslaught of negative media coverage earlier this year and subsequent patient surveys, we already know that public confidence and trust in us has waned dramatically. So you can be certain that if senior doctors join our nursing colleagues in taking strike action, there are plenty of media outlets who will just love to tear into us and seek to actively turn the public further against us. The Royal College of GPs has recently published a report with their ideas of what we should do, and it's called Fit for the Future 22. Now, the aim would be to increase the GP workforce, the training places, cut unnecessary workload, improve the interface between primary and secondary care, improve technology and premises, and focus more on the primary prevention of disease and wider population health. And it's a great report. Do take some time to read it. But it does need government and policymaker buy-in. The Health and Social Care Select Committee, which was until recently chaired by Jeremy Hunt, our Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was busy yesterday. They published a powerful report on the future of general practice just a few weeks ago. And that makes several strong recommendations to improve the equity of GP access, support the partnership model, prioritising relationship-based care, limiting list sizes and abolishing some of the incentive frameworks that are used to micromanage us. And if implemented by government, even in part, it will certainly make some improvements to our working lives. And tomorrow, the College Council here, chaired for the first time by Camilla Hawthorne, will debate exploring the introduction of non-GP doctors to general practice. And again, something that could help our workforce challenges, if done carefully and well, as it has done in secondary care with the rise of the senior associate specialist grades. But that's no quick fix. I've spent the last 2.5 years as chair of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. Now, that's the umbrella body for the 24 medical royal colleges and faculties that award CCT in the 4 nations of the UK and Ireland. And during that time, I have repeatedly witnessed that when the whole medical profession speaks together, it is an extremely powerful voice that cannot be ignored. So what about all of us doctors getting together and working together for a change? And I think now, given where we are as a profession and given the public and the political cycle, now is the time to set out a manifesto for change that acknowledges the Enid shaped issues and deals with them head on. So rather audaciously, I'm going to give you my 5-point plan to fix not just general practice, but the whole of the NHS and social care. Of course, it does complement the RCGP plan, Martin. So, first, let's put patients at the centre of care pathways, what we call rethinking medicine. Now, we've been talking about this for years. It's now time to act. We need to listen to our patients' needs and wants and act on them. It's not a nice to have, but a necessity to get patients as active partners in their own health and care. Co-production should be the absolute minimum that we accept in any system redesign. Let patients see the NHS budgets and then let them help us prioritise what they need. No more tokenism or lip service about patient engagement. Patients must be empowered to be active participants, not just passive recipients in their own care and in the wider care system design, so that we're working with, not just doing to, our patients. Now, as part of this, we have to incentivise continuity of care again in general practice and in medical care more widely. We can't keep continuity of care to ourselves. The evidence base is so clear-cut, and as Martin Marshall is so fond of saying, if continuity of care were a drug, nice would mandate that we used it. Secondly, we have to fund social care properly. Now, this is a massive ask for governments in all nations of the UK, but without it, everything else is in jeopardy. Now, there were some positive signs in yesterday's autumn statement, but it'll take an awful lot more than 2.7 billion over the next 2 years to fix social care. We must increase the salaries of those working in this sector, and I'd suggest we introduce a special carers' real living wage so that their employers can compete properly with Amazon and Aldi to attract and retain them. And we have to increase the funding to local government to pay for it. Third, you were waiting for this one, the workforce. Clearly, we need to expand the numbers of GPs, but also the numbers of most other doctors and most other healthcare professionals within and the wider NHS staff. And we need to embrace those new ways of working together. But we do need to make sure that doctors focus on doing what only we can do, so ensuring that patients are seen by the professional most appropriate for them, and the tasks and roles we don't need to be doing are done by others, which might seem contrary to what I implied earlier. But what I want is for senior doctors to have the time to care, the time to look at our patients holistically, to sit back, step back, and ensure that all this care is actually what our patients want and what's actually what they need and in their best interests. We also need to value our people better. Now, surely the availability of nutritious food for those working unsociable hours should be possible. We need to factor in the stuff that allows people to work who would otherwise be lost to the system. Childcare facilities, flexible working, and pensions that reward, not punish, staff for additional service. Fourth, we need to ensure that integrated care systems deliver for patients in the way they're supposed to, with the freedom to be creative and innovative for the benefit of local populations. And general practice, as well as other medical voices, must be heard in integrated care systems in England and at health boards in the devolved nations, with a GP and a hospital medic at every board. And finally, of course, we need to invest in the infrastructure of our service, the estate, the technology, and the diagnostic capability. And some NHS estate overhaul is underway and some tech overhaul is underway. But we dare not renege on the commitments to the NHS Green Agenda. Healthcare technology warrants a whole Mackenzie lecture in its own right, so I'm not going to go there other than saying that a truly comprehensive, integrated electronic care record isn't a luxury, it's an absolute minimum that we need to function safely. So those are my big 5. But I'm going to put it another way now because I do love an infographic. Let's have the patient at the centre of all health and care, a system that works for them, but where they understand the limits and benefits, where they're informed and empowered. With sufficient and appropriately trained workforce and infrastructure, which is all nested within a wider system that's working in an integrated way with social care and the other agencies that impact on health and well-being. Now that's my big vision. I'm taking a sip of water. But to get this to happen, it'll take all of us, to push this agenda forward. But I believe it starts with us GPs. GPs working with our medical colleagues across the health landscape, bringing the voices of our patients to the fore, so that we're providing pragmatic solutions for our politicians and policymakers, not just repeatedly highlighting the problems in ever more shrill voices, that we're demonstrating that we want to help. We want to make this right, to support and refresh our NHS and social care so that it really is fit for the future. Now, I'm going to go back to a couple of things I skipped over earlier before I answer the exam question of, is there a future for general practice in the UK? Social prescribing and waiting lists I skipped over. So let's do social prescribing first. Now, let's face it, this is just new terminology for something the good GPs have always done. And some of you will have heard me say before, it's what hairdressers, bartenders and religious leaders have always done, finding ways to help other people live their best life out with what the NHS or social care can offer. And that's one of our definitions up there. Now, I've been on a personal journey with this, and I'm proud to have been able to help set up the National Academy for Social Prescribing. And it's a registered charity now that aims to spark a social revolution by raising awareness about a movement that seeks to help people live their best life, establishing an evidence base for what works, making connections, finding and disseminating funds. But to do it, we had to define social prescribing and also what it includes. And so we've got these 4 pillars. But I give them in the order of advice and information, arts, culture and heritage, the natural environment and physical activity. And advice and information, just to be clear, that's nothing to do with a GP consultant dialogue that's going on in England at the moment. That's advice and guidance. Advice and information there means advisory charities, and it comes first in my list. Because if you are not safe, warm and well-fed, no park run or singing group, however marvellous, is actually going to be meaningfully beneficial to you. We need to help people with their basic human needs first, and then we work out what matters to them and help with connecting them. And social prescribing link workers have the time and resources to help so many more people than GPs ever could. Now, I could go on and on about that topic. It's very close to my heart, but time is passing. So what about those NHS record waiting lists? Now, there's a lot of great evidence out there that the NHS really should be putting into practice. Now, I don't know if you picked up during the lying in state of the Queen and that remarkable queue, fascinating research by Professor Keith Still, research on crowd science. He talked about the vital need of perceived fairness when people are in queues and on lists. And he said, so long as people know what's happening, what's expected of them, how long it's going to take, they no longer face uncertainty. And that keeps the crowd very much on your side. People are happy if they know what's happening, even if the update is to say, another update's coming. It's as soon as the information flow stops that you get a degree of uncertainty and people start behaving as individuals rather than as a collective. Now, National Voices are the umbrella charity for patient organisations, and they've done some great research on what patients want. And they've generated these I statements, and I'll let you read them. They really are evidence-based, and they're worthy of reading carefully. But this isn't rocket science. As citizens and patients ourselves, this is intuitively what we want to see and feel. And I'm just going to highlight the final one. I am not forgotten. Now, let's face it. Disneyland have been experts at queuing for decades. And even South West Trains, the much maligned rail companies, have an announcement that says, when we know, you'll know. So for anyone involved in managing NHS waiting lists, there's a really powerful evidence-based message here. Please keep people better informed. We all know as GPs the time that we waste day in, day out, and our admin teams, reassuring, guiding and signposting people who are languishing, suffering on NHS waiting lists. So, the exam question. Is there a future for general practice as we know it? You sort of know what I'm going to say, don't you? My heart, of course it says yes. But my head is less convinced unless we are prepared to grasp this moment collectively. I can't ever remember hearing so many colleagues saying so loudly that they've had enough. And all right, we are doctors and we do like to whinge, but it's never been as bad as this, is it? And I say that as somebody who is naturally upbeat and optimistic, and you should see my Myers-Briggs profile. So if you'll forgive a guarded response, I'm going to say, yes, of course there's a future for general practice, but it's just not quite as it used to be. And if that's the case, then it's down to us to shape the way it should be. All of us GPs and other doctors and healthcare professionals working with our patients and wider society and government to come up collectively with our NHS for the future. So, my new call to government now might look like this. This is our COVID-tinged world version. Give us and our patients the opportunity to help you redesign the NHS and social care system with enough time, enough resource and enough people, and we'll give you a great NHS. Now, this is a public lecture, and I've talked a lot about the need to work collaboratively. It is, after all, a Royal College of General Practitioners lecture. So I want to finish by leaving the GPs with some clear, positive messages. If you're feeling jaded right now as a GP, let me reassure you. The future for general practice is actually very bright indeed. The next generation of GP leaders inspire me every working day, and perhaps it's time that some of us need to be prepared to step aside and focus our energies on supporting and encouraging our newer colleagues to take up the baton and to lead instead. Trusting them with their energy and positivity to do the best for our discipline. Let their energy and vision have an outlet, and we need to have their backs while they do it. A decade ago, during the 2012 London Olympic Games, our fabulous college president, Claire Gerarda, picked up on the philosophy of the highly successful GB peloton team, the aggregation of marginal gains. It's by making many small changes that we can collectively make the big changes, and GPs are brilliant at this. Ours is the most remarkable profession. We're large, we're dynamic, we're everywhere, and we see what needs to be done, and we do it, patient by patient and practice by practice. But we do need to get better about sharing our ideas, and we need to be humble enough to try more of the innovation that our peers and our neighbours are championing. We need to suspend our disbelief a bit more, that wouldn't work around here, and give new systems, new ideas, new pathways a try, because general practice is always evolving. GPs are the most inspirational leaders and clinicians. Trust me on this. We've got so much more control than we give ourselves credit for. Fixing the NHS, we've got it. So, I'm at the end. It's time for the thank yous, and there was a real risk of this bit turned into a teary Oscars acceptance, but I have resisted. All of you listed on the slide, all of you, thank you. Thank you so much. You know who you are, and I hope that you know just how much I appreciate what you've done to support and guide me. Not just with this lecture, but more widely too. But finally, I do want to thank GPs and their teams, and indeed all other doctors and healthcare professionals everywhere, for what you do, your service and your sacrifice. Your lives are dedicated to making the lives of others better, and that is a serious calling. Together, we can. We will fix this NHS. Thank you all.
What a tour de force. What an amazing lecture. Not just its content, but its delivery. And I don't know about you, but I'm sort of tingling. I feel hopeful. I feel inspired. I feel that there is a future. I also feel, Helen, you're in the wrong job. I think there's a Secretary of State for Health post that... Well, what a marvellous lecture, and thank you so much, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you've done, and moving oceans, just shifting the future for us all. So thank you. And one more time, thank you very much. And if you want to come and toast Helen, there'll be alcohol, well, evidence-based, make sure you only have a number of units, because Helen's lecture says we've all got to do primary prevention, so... Anyway, there's a lovely drink out there in the reception. Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen. Don't forget your lecture.